It would be amazing if the World Brewers Cup champion made coffee for me every morning. I asked. Apparently they're busy. But this claims to get pretty close, and even though I'm a professional skeptic, I just had to test it. This is the xBloom Studio, an all-in-one coffee machine that houses a brewer/kettle, grinder, and scales. There are 3 ways to brew with it. Which one is best? You can set both temperature and volume for every single pour. How accurate is that? Are the pouring patterns and agitation a gimmick, or do they actually help? Is the grinder any good? And the most popular one, how does it compare to the Fellow Aiden? I'm sure you have a ton of questions, and I've got you covered. Also, xBloom just made 2 big changes that have completely changed my opinion on this machine. Let's get into it. Before we get started, this product was sent to us by xBloom to test and review. No money exchange hands. They've had no say in what we've put in this video, and they don't get to watch it before any of you do. As always, a huge thanks to Benki Brewing Tools for helping with all of the logistics. The original xBloom is a really cool product, but it kind of falls short where it matters the most, in the cup. What we have here is its successor, the Studio, which is essentially the same product with some big changes. This section still handles all of the water delivery, but now has a spout that actually moves, as opposed to the OG, which used a static charge to move the stream. The grinder is still the same, but you have smaller steps to have more control, and you can grind fine enough for espresso. There's a brand new display with 3 control knobs, a new pod holder, and Omni Dripper. You have integrated scales, higher flow rate, this one's clutch, and other minor changes. Oh, and the new one is made of plastic. So other than the build, the older sibling has well and truly been overshadowed in every respect. But none of these bells and whistles matter to me if the coffee hasn't improved. So let's brew a cup. By default, this machine boots into what is called Pro mode, and even the pros wouldn't know what to do here. I just find it really odd that an all-in-one coffee machine doesn't just let you pick and brew recipes straight off the bat. Instead, it lets you use the grinder, kettle, and scales separately. That's it. But let's table this issue for a second and check out the xPod workflow. So just take this card, tap it up here, and it immediately loads up the roaster recipe. Then you just take the pod, open it up, pour the beans in here, put the pod here, hit play. That's it. I love that you can see the entire brewing process, unlike the Aiden. And check this out. It even does the wiggle. How cool is that? I think all of the pours are done. We just wait for it to draw down now. That's it. That symbol means your coffee is ready. I mean, how simple was that? This is how you brew with the pods, but there are 2 other ways to brew with the xBloom, and we'll check those out a little later on. But now, while this coffee cools, let's talk a little bit more about this machine. We'll start with the pods. Yes, this is technically a pod machine, and in the world of specialty coffee, that is a dirty word. A very dirty word. But these are a little different. Well, for starters, like you just saw, they have whole beans on the inside, not pre-ground coffee, so you get to grind fresh before brewing, and that's almost always a good thing. The pod itself doubles as a pour-over dripper and even comes pre-fitted nicely with a negotiated paper filter. How cool is that? But the thing that truly sets it apart is the material they're made of. Here's what it says on the website. The xPod flat bottom dripper is made from sugarcane fiber bagasse, a biodegradable material compostable within 30 days that requires less energy to manufacture because it's left over from sugarcane processing. So technically more sustainable than say Nespresso, but they still need to be disposed properly. Waste disposal, sustainability, these are complex subjects that I'll save for another video. And honestly, environment, can you stop whining all the time? Oh, I have a fever, my temperature is rising, my snow caps are melting. Just shut the f up. I have my own problems. Have you seen how slowly this channel is growing? I don't see you offering to help. So let's move on to visual design. The original is striking and elegant, and this is no exception, albeit a little more conservative. The sleek, tall form gives it almost an architectural look, and the different size cuboids, levels, textures, and finishes make for a very interesting product in my opinion. And the cherry on top is this stunning dot matrix display, with the frosted screen that adds a beautiful bloom around the bright warm lights. I also love the way that the lights reflect off the knurled metal knobs in the pod holder, especially on the white one. But as much as I love this display, it leaves a lot to be desired on the UX front, but more on that later on. Even the drip tray works with the overall aesthetic, and everything comes together beautifully. Both colors look great, but I lean more towards the white. I think it looks more classy, and it isn't a fingerprint magnet like the black one. If I had to nitpick, I think a clear tank would have looked nicer than this smoky one on the white. But now, on to build quality. Again, the OG xBloom screams quality with its almost all metal build. The Studio, on the other hand, is mostly plastic. Luckily, it's high quality plastic that feels great, except for maybe the water tank lid. The texture makes it really nice to handle, and I love that the knobs and pod holder ring are both metal as their key touch points. The knobs use rotary encoders with detents, and they feel super satisfying to turn and click. The grinder is a bit rattly, nothing too concerning, but with so many moving parts, there are definitely more potential failure points. I can't speak to longevity yet, but I'll update the pinned comment below if anything breaks. Okay, the coffee is cool, so let's give it a taste and talk about how it is to use this on a day-to-day basis and if it lives up to the claims. So this is a really nice coffee from Prodigal called Boulder Blend. Let's give it a taste. Cheers. Man, these xPods are like magic. There's just no other way to put it. Oof. It still surprises me how good this is. It's sweet and balanced. The OG xBloom always left me wishing I'd brewed the coffee myself, but this delivers. It honestly tastes like it was brewed by someone who really knows what they're doing. Not surprising though, because these are very carefully dialed in by the roaster, so it's almost like they're brewing it for you. And if you check extraction, it gets over 20% pretty effortlessly. No weighing the beans, no setting grind size, no prepping the brewer, nothing. And most importantly, no faffing with the app. You do have the option to change grind size and ratio right before hitting play in case you want to tweak the roaster recipe. I've tried this dark roast from Box, the Boulder Blend from Prodigal, and this lovely clean wash from Aviary, and they've all been spot on. It really feels like cheating because this machine takes away all of the variables other than the water, so as long as you have fairly soft filtered water, you should be getting pretty excellent results. For comparison, Fellow drops with the Aiden is pretty similar, but you're not using the same grinder or grind size as the roaster, and those are pretty big variables. But it's not all sunshine and roses. I'm gonna finish up this coffee and clean up before I tell you why. Okay, I'm back. So there are two things to keep in mind when it comes to the xPods. One is that they're a tad more expensive than a regular bag of coffee, so you are paying a small premium for convenience, which I think is totally justified. The second thing is more of a gotcha, and that is availability. In North America, you have tons of options with Brian jetting around the country onboarding some incredible roasters. So whether you're on a pod subscription or buying carefully curated limited drops, you are truly getting the ultimate xBloom experience. Most other places, you're a third-class citizen at best, and that really sucks. People are pissed off. I may be wrong, but here's what I think the issue is and why the xPods aren't more ubiquitous outside the US. Firstly, xBloom is based in the US. They buy roasted coffee at a wholesale rate from different roasters, package them into these proprietary pods, and sell them. This is very location-specific and difficult to scale. Think about it. You can't be based out of the US and then buy roasted coffee from, say, India. It makes no sense. You'd need an India facility that can buy locally and pack the coffee into pods, and that is very expensive. Now, the other way in which the xPod business works is xBloom sells the pod packing hardware and empty pods to roasters so they can package their own coffee and sell directly. This is a little more scalable, but the roaster needs to be able to justify this investment. It's a bit of a catch-22 situation with customers not buying the xBloom studio because not enough roasters offer pods, and the roasters not buying the pod making hardware because not enough customers have xBloom studios in their location. This issue makes it very hard for me to recommend this product outside of the US because I think most people interested in a machine like this are looking for the kind of convenience only the pods give you. Well, the good news is they've made a recent change that I think could be huge. They now sell retail bags of coffee that ship with a roaster recipe card, just like the ones that come with the pods. Right at the beginning of this video, I said that xBloom has done two things that have massively impacted this review. This is one of them. Let me explain. Basically, they've taken this closed pod system and opened it up, making it way easier to onboard roasters, who now just need access to an xBloom studio. This significantly lowers the barrier to entry. So my hope is roasters around the world start to offer more xBloom ready coffees, making it a lot more attractive for customers outside of the US to buy the studio. I still think xBloom should carefully vet the roasters they onboard to maintain a certain level of quality. And that brings me to the second way in which you can use this machine. This is the Omni Dripper and is essentially a pretty fast-flowing flat-bottom dripper much like the Aurea. But the cool thing about it is that you can pull off this pod ring and attach it directly to the brewing cradle, which means that it can still move automatically to the grinder just like the pods, and more importantly, can use the agitation features built into the recipes. xBloom calls this way of brewing Copilot. Here's how it works. So once you receive an xBloom ready bag of coffee, weigh out the beans on the integrated scales and pour them into the grinder. Use the card to load up the recipe. Then just place the paper filter in. There's a little lip here that holds it in place. Neat little detail. Attach the Omni Dripper here and hit go. There's also a little bit of cleanup once the brew is done. So yeah, it's definitely a few more steps than using the pods, but I still think it's a very seamless and enjoyable workflow, even for someone who knows very little about coffee. You're also now paying less per cup of coffee. One pro tip though, I found that wetting and negotiating the wave filters in the Omni Dripper gets me closer to the pod brews, both in terms of extraction and taste. So I would recommend downloading and printing a negotiator. I've linked to the one I use below. Now, you can of course brew any coffee you have using the Omni Dripper, but you have the additional task of finding a recipe that works or building your own, both of which require the app. And that's the perfect segue to talk about exciting update number 2. So one of my biggest complaints with a lot of products that connect to an app is how reliant they are on the app to function properly. My preference is little to no reliance, and that is not the case here. Up until very recently, the xBloom relied so heavily on the app for almost everything, it was a real sticking point for me. I do not want to wake up in the morning and have to fiddle with my phone to brew a cup of coffee. That's just not a fun experience for me. So when they launched auto mode, exciting update number 2, it significantly changed the way that I feel about this machine. I mean, it still needs the app more than I'd like, but at least now, once it's set up, I can go pretty much app free. Let me show you. So by default, it boots into pro mode, which I think is very weird, like I said earlier. Luckily, you can now fire up the app and switch to auto mode. I do wish you could do this without the app though. But auto mode is basically quick access to 3 recipes of your choice, and for each recipe you can toggle this if you want to use the scales to weigh out beans before brewing. A simple update with a massive impact on the UX. Even as someone who's very nerdy about coffee, 95% of the time I don't need anything more than the 3 recipes I have loaded in here, which means 95% of the time I don't need the app. Amazing. There is, however, one issue and a massive missed opportunity here. The issue is you do need to remember the dose for each recipe. A could be 15 and B could be 12. If you dose wrong, you'll f up the brew. And that brings me to the missed opportunity. When you have the scales option turned on, it would be sick if the machine just automatically scaled the recipe based on how much coffee you weigh out. If anyone from xBloom is watching, can you please implement this? It would be amazing. So that's auto mode, and I absolutely love it. We'll be checking out the app soon, but now, where was I before this auto mode tangent? Oh yes. Brewing your own coffee with the Omni Dripper. So when brewing a coffee that doesn't come with a roaster recipe, you now give up even more on the convenience front, and the minimum required knowledge on brewing also goes up pretty significantly. If you know what you're doing, then this could be a happy place because the possibilities are endless. If you don't, then it can quickly descend into deep misery and frustration. So if you plan to buy the xBloom to brew your own coffee, just know that the learning curve is a little steeper and it's a slightly longer journey to a great cup of coffee. That being said, once you're dialed in and have that recipe saved, it will brew that coffee again and again with incredible consistency. Here's a pro tip. This spout is not capable of very high agitation, so if you're brewing lighter roasts, I found that I get the tastiest cups when I use recipes that have 5 or more pours. So overall, the Omni Dripper is great, and judging by the detachable base, I'm sure we'll see some variants of this soon. I hope they make a cone attachment. I think that would be really interesting, and maybe even a glass or ceramic one with recipes tweaked to include a preheat cycle. But now, let's look at the third way in which you can use the xBloom, which is with your own dripper. Yes, the xBloom is essentially a smart kettle, so you can use it with your own drippers. Couple of caveats though. Firstly, stick to the smaller ones like the V6001, Kono, StagX, and even the Deep 27. These can comfortably be centered under the spout. The Oreo works, but it's a little taller, putting the bed further away from the spout, so you may need to compensate by changing temperature. You can even experiment with the pouring radius on the app. Heck, I've even brewed some bangin' automated Sophie brews. It's a lot of fun if you're into tinkering with recipes, and that brings me to the second caveat. Things get a lot more nerdy here because most of the recipes on the app, if not all, are either for xPods or the Omni Dripper, so you're going to have to build your own from scratch or search for ones other customers have made on the internet that are specific to your brewer. And lastly, you got to do more manual labor. The cradle can no longer move the dripper to the grinder, so you have to grind into the catch cup and transfer. What a bloody chore. But more importantly, you lose the cool automatic agitation features. Having to do that manually when everything else is automated is pretty annoying. But the truth is, as fun as this looks, at this point, the only thing you're missing if you just brew manually with a kettle is being able to change the temperature for each pour. I think most people would be very satisfied with just the Omni Dripper. It does an excellent job, and hopefully they launch variations of it to satiate some of the more nerdy customers. But the thing is, having a device that can dispense water at any temperature almost instantly opens up a lot of other use cases. Click the middle knob in Pro mode to go free solo. Here, it's like controlling a kettle with 3 knobs. The one on the right is to start and stop pours, and the other 2 to change temperature and pouring patterns, center, circle, or spiral for each pour. You can do as many pours as you like, and you also have a timer which starts when you do the first pour and continues in the background until you end the brew, which can be done by turning the right knob until you see an X and click. It's pretty cool. When it comes to coffee, it's super useful for the AeroPress or even filling up the chamber of something like the PicoPresso. Outside of this, I've seen people use it for tea. In fact, xBloom plan to launch a tea brewer attachment very soon. Heck, you can even use it for cup o noodles. You are limited only by your creativity. So yeah, those are the ways in which you can brew with the xBloom, and in any of these modes, you can skip the grinding step if you want to use your own grinder. Yes, even with the pods. Just keep turning the grind size coarser until it reads off. Staying on the topic of grinding, these 48mm cone burrs produce very balanced cups. In fact, I find the profile very similar to the EasyPresso K-series grinders, which are great. You get decent separation, good acidity presentation, and a lot of sweetness, and it also seems to work really well across roast levels. For a built-in grinder on a machine at this price point, I'm really impressed. And yes, this can grind for espresso too. With medium and dark roasts, you get some really tasty shots, and the dial-in process is not terrible. Light roasts can be done, but it's a little more painful, and you can find yourself at the finest grind setting, especially if you're using some of these fancy baskets. Other features that I think are really cool is that the grind size is set electronically. It has variable RPM from 60 to 120, and it also sports an ionizer and sweeper, making for a really clean grinding experience. And the anti-static tech built into the Omni Dripper and the catch cup make things even neater. Now, other than the grinder, we also tested a bunch of other stuff on the xBloom to see how well they work. First up, we have the pouring patterns and agitation, where the machine wiggles the brewer left and right, and we wanted to check how effective these features were. We've made an entire video on pouring linked up here and what a big impact it can have on the cup, and it's no different here. Physics is physics, and you can taste the difference when you change up the pours. Agitation again is an excellent feature. It helps bump up the extraction and also levels out the bed to facilitate more even flow through the grounds. If you follow this channel for a while, then you know that I'm a huge fan of the wiggle. And no, that's not a viral TikTok dance trend. If you're confused, then check out this video. Speaking of following the channel, our stats show that 77% of you who watch regularly aren't subscribed. Come on. Click on that button. It has a massive impact on the reach and growth of this channel. Okay, back to the review. Let's talk temperature for a second because it's really important. One cool feature is that the xBloom automatically caps the max temperature based on your altitude to prevent boiling and spluttering. Now, with machines like the xBloom Studio and Fellow Aiden, you can literally set a different temperature for each pour. But I of course wanted to test if it actually hits those numbers accurately. So to test this, I stuck a K-type probe right under the tip of the spout and built 2 custom recipes. One to do 4 90-degree pours, and the other going from 90 to 80, back up to 90, then down to 85 to see how well it handles big and small swings. Here's the graph for the 4 90-degree pours, and other than the first pour being a little cooler, the other 3 are pretty locked on. And the first one is lower only because it was a cold start. With the fluctuating temperatures, it's still good but isn't quite as locked on. This is especially true for big drops in temperature, like the second pour, which goes from 90 all the way down to 80. Here you can see that it tends to dip pretty well below the target, in this case down to 65, before it recovers back up to 80. With smaller shifts of 5 degrees, it does a lot better. So overall, I think the performance is solid, and understanding these quirks will make it way easier to troubleshoot if you aren't getting the results you want. The water tank has limited capacity, and I find myself refilling every 2 or 3 brews. The low water level warning is pretty aggressive. I measured this and it won't let me run a recipe unless I have over 280 mils. This is a little annoying, but I definitely prefer it to running out of water mid-brew like on the Aiden. A cool feature here is that you can plumb it into a larger water tank, so you don't need to keep refilling. Just remember that you can't connect it to a pressurized water source like a tap without additional hardware. The other thing we wanted to check was the accuracy with which it dispenses water. This is important because you can change the ratio of a brew if it's off by too much. Here, it was within 2 to 2.5 mils of the target, which is great. As you can see here, pour 1 was supposed to be 63 and it landed a tad higher, and the total brew output was meant to be 255 and it landed just over 257. This is very impressive. Another really cool feature is overflow detection. I haven't been able to test this myself, but apparently this machine tracks the output weight using the integrated scales, and if it's too low compared to the amount of water that's been dispensed, it'll stop the pour. Now, speaking of the built-in scales, these are way more responsive than I expected. In Pro mode, just click on the rightmost knob and you can use them to weigh anything. It can be a little awkward weighing things under here, there isn't a ton of room. The scales also show a live readout of the beverage weight when brewing with the app. Okay. What do you say we check out the app? This thing has a ton of features, so let's run through them quickly. Using the app, you can access the same Pro mode features, you can favorite your recipes, change various settings including the pouring radius and even the vibration strength of the wiggle. You can also switch to auto mode and select your 3 recipes here. You have access to a ton of community created recipes. This one by Ferrin is great. My recipe is linked in the description below and is what I use most of the time. I wish there was a way to duplicate recipes though. To create a recipe, tap here. You can then toggle the grinder on and off, then choose whether the recipe is for an xPod, the Omni Dripper, or your own dripper. xPod is typically what roasters use for their pods. The Omni Dripper has a max dose of 18 grams and other caps out at 25 grams. Pick all of your brew parameters and you're ready to start adding pours. Click here to add a pour, then set the volume, temperature, flow rate, how long you want it to wait after a pour, the type of pour, and if and when you want it to wiggle. As you build out your recipe, pay attention to this value. Now, all of your pours combined need to be equal to the total water volume, so you need to get this value down to 0. I find this a bit clunky and also weird that the value can go below 0, so you end up having to fiddle with these volume sliders. They should have called this DJ mode. I think you can add up to 9 pours, but it can get a bit confusing beyond 5. Once you're done, you can save the recipe. And lastly, when you run a brew from the app, you can see this cool graph of the water input and the coffee output. Pop your phone onto the slot up here and it works as a stand, which is really neat. A little nerdy, but I would also love to see the output flow rate displayed here to see how quickly the brew is drawing down. So yeah, tons of features, looks nice and decently thought out, but like I said, it can get a bit clunky when you have many pours. My biggest issue though is the inability to quickly scale a recipe. Check this out. If you change the ratio when editing a recipe, you have to go in and DJ each pour manually. Just give us an auto scale button already. Here's another idea outside of the app. Instead of allowing a user to change the ratio before starting a brew, just let them set the dose and have the machine do the math and scale the recipe proportionally. And of course, there's that auto mode feature that I proposed earlier. That would be... Man, I should really stop dishing out ideas like this for free. xBloom, I shall send you an invoice for consultation once I'm done recording. But now, onto the fun stuff. Things that annoy me. Okay, here are 10 things that really annoy me about the xBloom. Number 1, the water tank is taller than me and just as unstable. If I pull this out, place it on a table and refill, what are the odds it tips over? Yeah, it's quite a nerve-wracking experience. 2, the drip tray is very shallow, so the capacity is next to nothing, and if a stream of water is hitting it, there's splatter all over the place. Also, this gap behind the scales can be a pain in the ass to clean because it collects coffee grounds and splashes. 3, auto mode has made the issue way more tolerable, but I still think xBloom is too reliant on the app. As beautiful as the display is, it's so basic it just feels like a lost opportunity. They could have made it do so much more and reduce the dependency on the app. What's ironic is that it's so simple, yet so confusing to use. Things like having to turn this play knob to get the X to go back, that's not obvious. Or needing to go all the way coarse to turn the grinder off, or even expecting users to figure things out using hieroglyphics. I mean, any guesses what this symbol is? So yeah, looks great, not super intuitive. Number 4, I just mentioned my frustrations with the app. Recipe scaling is definitely my biggest complaint. Number 5, the flow rate range is mind-blowing. I can go from 3 grams per second all the way to a whopping 3.5. Speechless. Speaking of flow rate, number 6 would be the low flow rate, thin piddling stream, and unimpressive breakup length mean that you aren't getting a ton of agitation. Luckily, it's better than the OG, and I can compensate by increasing the number of pours and still brew bangers. Number 7, if you get used to brewing with pods, it's very hard to go back to brewing any other way, especially if you're lazy. 8, there's a lot of electronics and moving parts in here, so things could go wrong. xBloom is a fairly new company and I'm not sure how good the customer service is, so just something to keep in mind. 9, it's a little noisy overall, both the grinder and the pump. And now for the grand finale, number 10. So when you're brewing pour over coffee, it's pretty important to have the dripper be level. Now check out this wonder of the world elegantly leaning off to one side. And it gets worse, even the holder can rock back and forth. Seriously? You've made this super sophisticated machine that brews with such precision, and you didn't think to minimize human error? Think I'm exaggerating? Try it. Just place the pod on the holder 10 times casually like you would in normal use, and see how many of those times it actually sits flat. It is frustratingly easy to place incorrectly. So to all current and future xBloom owners, here's a PSA. Ensure that the pod is level before hitting go. Even the Omni Dripper rocks. Not in a good way. Anyway, those are my 10 complaints. Let's move on. So after we published our Fellow Aiden review, we were bombarded with comments and DMs asking how it compared to the xBloom. So here are my thoughts on the subject, having used both extensively over the last few months. I'll start with Aiden's strengths. Even though it's close, I found that Aiden manages to pull out a little more sweetness and also have better texture than the xBloom when using light roasts. It's not a massive difference by any means, but it's there. Aiden brews also tend to be a little more consistent, probably because it brews in a closed chamber and isn't affected by ambient temperature. Also, the Aiden effortlessly does anywhere from 1 to 10 cups of coffee. xBloom is designed to brew just 1 cup at a time. So if you need to brew larger batches, then you only have one choice. And lastly, as clunky as the UX is, if you're making your own recipes, Aiden is definitely more beginner friendly. The xBloom app can be pretty intimidating and overwhelming. But now, onto the xBloom Studio. Firstly, it's a much more polished product, better build quality, and just nicer to use in almost every way. You can also see the coffee being brewed and smell it, which I really miss when using Aiden the black box. Next, it's an all-in-one machine and you have everything you need right here to make a great cup of coffee. The grinder is really good and the roaster recipes translate better because they're being dialed in on the exact same equipment. Next up are the pods. There is no easier or more convenient way that I know of to get a delicious cup of filter coffee. And it's still really good even with the Omni Dripper. Also, I think the xBloom is more versatile. With the Aiden, even though the cups are stellar, you get an Aiden style brew and that's it. With the xBloom, you can do pods, the Omni Dripper, you can play with negotiating the filters, you can use many of your own drippers, and you can even do stuff outside of coffee. Now coming to the app, if you want to build a very specific recipe and have full control over all of the parameters, then as things stand now, you can only do that on the xBloom app. From setting different volumes per pour to agitation to picking pouring patterns, you have access to a lot more variables. And lastly, for light roasts, Aiden wins. But for medium roasts, it's kind of tied. And with dark roasts, the xBloom pulls ahead. It's capable of lower agitation, so just decreasing the number of pours works wonders to reduce bitterness and astringency. So there you have it. They both have their strengths, and which one you pick entirely depends on what you want from an automatic pour-over brewer. To be very frank, it's really hard to pick between these, but if someone forced me to, then I'd probably pick the xBloom. Even though I prefer the Aiden brews, this is just nicer to use. Okay, we've covered a ton of ground, so let's bring it all together and draw some conclusions. At $500 US, I think the Studio is really competitively priced for what it does, but who is it for? Firstly, if you're someone who loves filter coffee but cannot be asked to learn how to brew, then I can't think of an easier way to make a good cup of filter coffee than with the xPods. Just make sure they're available where you live. But like I mentioned, if you're able to get a retail bag with a roaster recipe, that comes pretty close in terms of convenience and you save a little money. Secondly, I would also recommend the xBloom to beginner and intermediate brewers looking to get a little more hands-on and tweak parameters to tailor brews to their palate. And lastly, for the advanced nerdy brewers, there's a ton of features in here that will keep you occupied for a long time, and it's also a very capable brewer, as we've seen. But there's a catch. As someone who falls into this category, when I'm truly tinkering, I almost never use the built-in grinder because I have better grinders. So you could very well end up feeling like you paid extra for something you don't use. Just something to keep in mind. So yeah, that's the xBloom Studio, and while it isn't quite the same as having Martin Wolfel brew for you every day, it really does get pretty close, as long as you have access to xBloom ready coffees where you live. And on that note, I think it's time we wrap this one up. Thank you so much for watching, and brew ARAMSE.